Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 5. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. So we've talked a lot about strategies for doing hybrid cloud and what people are using in the industry. I think one of the things that has come up a couple of times so far is the platform as a service offerings out in the market. And one of the most popular of those is probably Red Hat OpenShift. And so I'm interested if we can dive a little deeper into that, because it's not something that I personally know a lot about. So I would be keen to hear a bit more from the rest of you about your experiences with Red Hat OpenShift and whether that's something you think is a valuable tool in the hybrid cloud space.
I don't mind talking a little about this as someone who has almost no experience in OpenShift either. I gave it a go over the weekend, just deploying a couple of Golang projects because I'm learning it right now. And it was just interesting to see my wheelhouse is AWS, so it was a little different, but actually in some ways fairly intuitive. It didn't take me very long to get something up and running, and I kind of appreciated that because, again, being damaged to AWS, it can be quite daunting. I don't know if that experience is what made OpenShift kind of easy just to use and play around, but it was quite surprisingly nice and kind of well tailored to an engineering environment. One thing that helped a bit as well, if we jump on all the hype bandwagons, was I used ChatGPT to get me going and debug some of the issues. It would give me wrong answers for a lot of what I was looking at, but it was wrong answers that would point me in the right direction. So I got something out pretty quickly. So I'm pretty impressed. A couple of things that made me a little nervous were we talk about being against vendor lock-in, and that's awesome, but it does feel like OpenShift is another vendor lock-in. It's just kind of a meta vendor lock-in layer. How it seems to work, and do correct me if I'm wrong, is you define, let's say you want to run on AWS, you will define a resource provider that'll connect to that AWS service, say it's an S3 bucket or whatever, and then you utilize that within your OpenShift, which makes sense, right? You're not defining entities connecting directly to AWS, you're just leveraging the abstraction layers on top of that. So you're defining your platform very much in OpenShift. So if you want to get out of vendor lock-in, bringing yourself to vendor lock-in seems like a strange option, but I can't think of a better way. But it was just something I came across while I was digging around.
Yes, I have seen Red Hat OpenShift specifically as a separate thing on some of the clouds like Azure. So I think it is a thing that you do on top of clouds as well as on top of your on-prem estate.
Yeah, it's not so much you're trading vendor lock-in for vendor lock-in. It's you're now going from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service. And you can run that abstraction layer on top of all the major clouds. They all have support. And the idea here is that you can plug and choose which clouds you want to do, but the abstraction layer, right, the platform stays the same.
I'll ask a basic question then. I mean, people talk about it as a platform as a service. Is it Kubernetes or is it not Kubernetes?
It's an incredibly opinionated Kubernetes implementation. It's probably the way that I would best describe it.
It's a superset of Kubernetes. So it's all Kubernetes is plus batteries.
And what does that really mean? So I've got containers, presumably are still the workhorse of my estate. How is it pacified?
So you've got the resource providers, like Shane mentioned, on top of that. And you've then also got tie-ins with things like LDAP or kind of SSO stuff. And then you've got a nice UI on top of it that your developers can log into and use and ClickOps their way around things. So, for example, I could define a blessed My Company MongoDB setup, which has the correct number of replicas, the storage is defined in the correct way, and a developer can go in and say, I want MongoDB. They click a button that says MongoDB, and it deploys the version of MongoDB with all of the correct configuration for my company. All of the secrets and the rotation and stuff are all managed nicely. So it's very much those, like you said, Sean, batteries included Kubernetes implementation.
Right. And if you were going to do all of the batteries yourself or put your batteries in yourself for that same example, which tools would you be reaching for if you were doing it in a more pure Kubernetes sense?
Probably something like Helm would be the most common way of doing it. You'd have a set of blessed Helm charts or something that your company had written and had all of those things in, and you'd just deploy using that. So rather than deploying using Helm, you're deploying using the OpenShift UI and all of those PaaS things in there that you define yourself, all of those resources.
So how does it compare then to the PaaS offerings from the clouds themselves?
From my brief look at it, it being more opinionated made it easier to connect to the idea of running like workloads in the cloud. So rather than all the foot guns that AWS provide or any cloud provider provides, you're given an opinionated abstraction layer, right? But it's easier to now use and reason about. And that UI is really impressive. Like I, as a developer, there just seems to be different modes. So you can be administrator or developer. And as a developer, I see a certain set of things that is relevant to me as a developer. I, as administrator, see a certain set of things that are useful for me. And because of that, you're just doing a lot less boilerplate and setting up as you normally would in AWS.
I'm also learning one thing and I can run it anywhere, right? Is the big advantage. So rather than learning Lambda and App Service and Google Compute, whatever the equivalent is there, I'm learning OpenShift in one place and my workload can run anywhere.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because yes, you've learned skills that you can apply anywhere that there's Red Hat OpenShift, but on the flip side, you haven't learned how to do those things using vanilla Kubernetes. So you're fine if you know how to drive that thing, if that thing is what you want to drive. But the flip side is that you don't have those skills to build on top of any Kubernetes and achieve the same objectives.
I don't know if I'd say that you don't end up with the skills to build on top of any Kubernetes, because it is pretty easy to strip away that OpenShift layer and get to the raw Kubernetes underneath. Like kubectl works absolutely fine against an OpenShift cluster. You can go and look at the YAML manifest for your deployment, and that would, by and large, be able to be picked up and run in a normal Kubernetes cluster. There's a bunch of caveats to that I'll get into later. So you can get to the underlying Kubernetes, but you don't have to if you don't want to.
Would it make sense to, though? If you were advising somebody to use Red Hat OpenShift, would you advise them to use the built-in OC or whatever it is tools, or would you advise them to use kubectl?
As a developer, you should absolutely be using OC and the web UI. As an administrator, you very quickly run into situations where you need to use kubectl to get to the things that are a little bit more advanced, in my experience.
So how does it deal with the cloud storage or identity or whatever? Are those tied in at all into Red Hat OpenShift, or are you expected to use the Red Hat OpenShift versions of those things?
So as an administrator, my understanding is that you would define those things for your developers. So you would define what block storage would look like on AWS versus Azure versus GCP. And OpenShift handles behind the scenes whether it's spinning up something like an EBS volume versus an Azure virtual disk.
Does that face some of the challenges that we talked about in previous episodes around platform engineers abstracting away concepts that the developers need to get into in order to have more flexibility with their specific workloads?
I guess the question is, does a developer need to understand what the underlying storage is, or do they just need to know that they've got a persistent volume claim and they're writing stuff to it?
Yeah.
It's where you draw the line, isn't it? In a given organization. In my experience, it doesn't necessarily matter what the persistent volume claim is, as long as there's a persistent volume claim. In other organizations, developers might care a little bit more.
I guess it's going to depend on the OpenShift implementation. Again, I'm from a position of ignorance here. I still, as a developer, want to reason about block storage or some sort of compute, wherever that compute might live. Does it present dashboards for those sorts of integrations? So it's kind of, I don't care what it is behind, but I need to know if it's lots of gigabytes or logging lots of stuff, or there's security events. Does anyone know if OpenShift supports that sort of stuff?
I think that's the kind of thing where you still need to have an understanding, or certainly someone in the organization still needs to have an understanding of the underlying cloud that OpenShift is running on. Because you're right, you'd still need to handle backing up those volumes or making sure that they're on the correct storage class or resizing them or, and.
Those are administrator problems, right? Those aren't developer problems.
I guess what the point I was getting to was, if you're going to abstract away an entire cloud from the engineers, are you presenting enough information through OpenShift to make sure that they still can reason about and understand what's been deployed?
Like Gary said, it depends on the developer and how deep do they want to go.
Yeah, and perhaps that's a nice way to go into like some of the issues I've seen with OpenShift in the past, where I was working with a group of developers who were doing large-scale machine learning on top of OpenShift. And as part of that, they were running a Redis cluster inside OpenShift and were running into all sorts of performance issues, memory exhaustion, all kinds of stuff. And what it turned out was that they were assuming that Redis could use transparent huge pages, which at the time the version of OpenShift we were running didn't support. And we certainly weren't running their worker nodes on instance types that would have been suitable for it. So that was one of those times where actually it would have been really useful and stopped a developer banging their head against a wall, wondering why they were having all these performance issues with Redis for about a week, if they'd understood a little bit more of what it was running on. My solution to that was actually just using a managed service for that rather than running it inside the OpenShift cluster, because I didn't want to start messing around enabling transparent huge pages. But yeah, you're right. There definitely are situations where it's useful for a developer to have a little bit more information under the scenes rather than just what they're seeing in the logs for a given pod.
Yeah, it's a difficult challenge OpenShift's going after, in that they're going to try interact with all these clouds and integrate all of this complexity. And I imagine a lot's being handed over to the administrator to handle, but it's a hard problem to solve, particularly as a lot of cloud providers won't be entirely consistent with each other. So in that regard, it's whatever the implementation level, it's pretty impressive.
You also have to hope that an administrator is making the right decisions for you in terms of, like, should I be running my database inside the cluster, or should I be running my database on a managed database service or something? There's pros and cons to both. The first one gives a developer a bunch of freedom to see what their database is doing. The second one, you might need a little bit more orchestration and a bit more tooling there for a developer to see what the performance of their database is. You might need to take those log files and those performance graphs and spit them out to Datadog or something like that so a developer can see them if you're not giving them access to your cloud console. So it is a really tricky thing, and I think you're right. There is a bunch of stuff that then falls to the administrator that in a normal cloud world where a developer's got at least read-only access to the AWS console or the Azure console that they perhaps wouldn't have to deal with.
Has anyone experience of running OpenShift alongside cloud providers? I hear that, and to me it sounds like a muddled mess of, like, which interface do I go to find this information out? Do I go to my cloud provider? Do I go to OpenShift? Like, do they integrate well? It feels complicated.
Well, it is.
So I have run OpenShift at production scale in the past. And like I said, our solution for this was to abstract as much of the kind of logging and tracing and metrics away from OpenShift and the cloud provider as possible. So in our environment, it was only the operations team that had access to the AWS console, and therefore we were the only people who could go and look at CloudWatch metrics or terminate nodes on the underlying OpenShift cluster and things like that. So we abstracted that away and pushed all of our metrics into Datadog, which at great cost allowed developers to then go and view those things. It also meant that they then had a standardized way of pushing metrics and logs out. So it didn't matter if the platform was running in AWS or Azure or on-prem, or in a few cases in Oracle Cloud. They had a standard place that they went to look at their logs and metrics, and they didn't have to go and learn 2 or 3 different things. They learned Datadog, they learned the Elk stack, and they learned OpenShift. And that was what they needed to know in order to keep their applications running.
That sounds quite sensible, actually. OpenShift is like your write operator and Datadog for reading. Like that's reasonably elegant.
Presumably all of these big providers like Datadog have got ways that you talk to them natively in OpenShift, just like they do for if you are doing that in regular cloud services.
Yeah, we just used the normal Kubernetes sidecar containers, and they worked absolutely fine.
We've chatted a bit about vendor lock-in, and I thought OpenShift sounded like a pretty great project, but I assumed when something starts with the word open, it's open source, and suddenly learned that it's actually this massive, expensive enterprise Red Hat project. So does anyone know of any open source equivalents to this that people could use?
OKD is the open source upstream, I guess, for want of a better term, for OpenShift, in the same way that CentOS would be for RHEL, and I guess Fedora for CentOS if you're really thinking about it. So OKD is pretty good. The only thing that I found was that actually when OpenShift 4, the latest version, got released, there was a big lag between OpenShift 4 being released and OKD 4 becoming publicly available. But that was also around the time that the whole CentOS/CentOS Stream thing was going on. So there wasn't really a distro that you could build OpenShift 4 or OKD 4 on top of, so it was a little bit of a mess. I think most of that is sorted out now. OKD 4 certainly seems to exist. I haven't played with it. We were running OKD 3.11 in dev test in my last place.
So if OKD is the sort of free upstream or downstream, whichever, of OpenShift, are they the same? Are there differences?
In theory, they should be functionally the same. I think in reality, there's a lot of work that Red Hat have done to integrate proper OpenShift with the various cloud providers, in that it spins up in a nice way. It manages all of the instance types and node types and things that you're using. And therefore, with proper OpenShift, you can just go into your cloud provider's console and say, I want Red Hat OpenShift on Azure or Red Hat OpenShift on AWS, and it spins it up and manages that for you. With OKD, my experience has been that actually that's usually a little bit more involved, and you end up running OKD on something like EC2 or Azure VMs rather than having that native one-click installation.
Additionally, there are some benefits that Red Hat is baking into OpenShift that will unlikely make it to OKD. Like at the Red Hat Summit, they recently announced that they're bringing the Red Hat OpenShift AI to OpenShift as an integrated product. And I've yet to see anything about that making its way up to OKD. I assume it probably won't.
I guess that leads me to, if someone out there is listening to this and trying to decide what to use in their home lab, in their house, if they're wanting to start playing with this stuff, should they be using OKD? Should they be using some developer edition-y type thing of OpenShift? Or would you say that actually they're better to actually learn vanilla Kubernetes and all the bits that make up an equivalent?
Yes, and yes, is my opinion.
If you already are a Red Hat subscriber and you're already using their products, then it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and start learning OpenShift, whether that's using their 30-day free trial or just running OKD. If you are not, then I would recommend you start learning Kubernetes, because what you learn with just straight up vanilla Kubernetes is directly applicable to OpenShift if you have to go down that route later on.
My lived experience is that you should skip it and just go and learn Kubernetes. And that's for multiple reasons. But the main reason is that OpenShift is incredibly opinionated. And if you go down the road of moving all of your build environments into OpenShift, relying on all of the platform as a service and developer features, and then you want to run it in production later on, it is a lot of work to then have to go and implement that stuff yourself and run it in vanilla Kubernetes. In addition, what I found was that migrating things out of OpenShift once they're already in production is a massive undertaking, because you're effectively relying on all of the builds being in OpenShift. You're relying on the way OpenShift does ingress and the way that it manages those routes into things. You are relying on your image registries being in OpenShift. And having to back those things out is a massive, massive undertaking, particularly if the reason that you put OpenShift in place in the first place is that you have a small team and you want to abstract some of that stuff away. And I say this because just in 2020, I spent about 6 months on a project where we only had 2 ops guys having to do a reverse migration out of OKD on AWS and move into EKS. And the way that we had to do that without interrupting developers too much, because we were a startup, was moving production first. And that's a really scary thing to do when your business is doing ticketing for many rail operators. So I would take it as a cautionary tale that if you use OpenShift, know that it's opinionated, know what you're getting into, and try and be selective about the things that you use Red Hat's opinionated thing for.
It feels to me like the ideal, when we talk about trying to balance these things, like improving the developer experience and making things easy for everybody, it feels to me like the ideal would be if you could give that user-friendly experience for developers, but end up with standard OCI images that you could deploy on a standard Kubernetes. Is that a pipe dream? Is that something that makes some sense?
Well, you can. What you get out of OpenShift is an OCI format. So you can totally take that build output and put it on Kubernetes, no problem. The advantage of OpenShift is if I have a Java application then I can just tell OpenShift, package it, put it in the registry, and then deploy it and it'll do it on its own using things that the other teams or other admins have set up. If you did that manually, you'd have to set up the right CI/CD pipelines. You'd have to create a registry. You'd have to get the authentication credentials, put it into your CI/CD to push it, all those extra steps. But to answer your direct question, you can totally do that.
Yeah, and this is why I said that we ended up moving production first, right? Because we had all of our CI/CD, all of the nice OpenShift stuff, LDAP integration, everything that was really great for developers and was really great for test environments. But what happened was when we got to a scale that we wanted to spin up 50 of these environments for various customers, we weren't going to deploy 50 OpenShift clusters for that, right? Like that was a real administrative overhead. And we spoke earlier about a lot of stuff being moved onto administrators. I think at large scale is where this becomes a problem. So what we ended up having to do was actually add an extra step to all of those builds to push a copy of that OCI compliant container image to an external registry. And then we had to put all of the tooling in place ourselves to deal with deploying that to a normal Kubernetes cluster. It then meant that we had to do a second round of testing before everything went in prod to make sure that all of the different ingress controllers and things that we had in vanilla Kubernetes worked in the way that we expected. So we then had to hand crank all of that tooling to put things into a production environment which wasn't OpenShift. And I think that is where some of these past things become a problem, because you got this nice opinionated happy path for developers and test and everything else. But it's then when you need to put it into production at something that's really easy to build and scale, that it's really then comes down to the administrators to have to work out a way to do that.
But tell me why you couldn't just have 50 OpenShift clusters.
Have you looked at the licensing costs for OpenShift? It's crazy. And not only that, right, we're then thinking about we've got to scale our LDAP infrastructure to 50 different AWS accounts across a bunch of different regions. We've got to have all of the overhead of running the master nodes and the router nodes and all of the OpenShift stuff on top of that that's taking up extra resource that we don't actually need because all we've got is some Spring Boot Java applications and a couple of databases. It doesn't need all of the overheads that OpenShift has for developers to run this in a nice pass way. What we actually just want is we've got some Spring Boot applications in a container that need to run somewhere. And OpenShift feels overkill for that, particularly paying OpenShift licensing costs per machine in a production environment feels really overkill for that.
It just kind of strikes me there's a lesson there, which is no matter what platform as a service you're going to use or provider, get the crystal ball out and have a think about where you think you're going to grow and what does that look like in whatever tool you're going to use. Because I'm surprised that managing many environments, yeah, it doesn't surprise me it's expensive, but that it would be a pain to actually manage that. But that's the risk with opinionated tools, that as soon as you go outside the common use case, hey, it's great for a weekend project, but things start to suck.
Yeah, and I've no doubt that if we were a bigger team, that absolutely running OpenShift at scale wouldn't have been so much of an issue. But the reason that the business chose OpenShift in the first place was because they had one DevOps guy who put it in, and then suddenly they went through this massive scale-up phase and still only had 3 DevOps guys and 2 TechOps guys who were doing deployments and things. And that's where it really got challenging, because we had to either work out a way that we could scale OpenShift really quickly or work out a way that we could get those containers and run them in some kind of open tooling.
In Kubernetes, this is also a common problem that we have. And there's a lot of products that come up about this. Like you can use Rancher or Crossplane or even just straight Terraform to kind of provision these things at scale. Are there similar products, or can you do that at scale with OpenShift as well?
I think you probably could, but it's all of the surrounding tooling for it, I think is the big issue for me. It's not just OpenShift that I'm spinning up, right? I'm spinning up extra LDAP nodes. I'm spinning up all of the OpenShift control plane that's taking up compute resource. I'm doing all of these things when actually what I need to do is run a Java application in a container.
Right.
And that's what it comes back to for me. And I know I've repeated the same answer, but it's just all of that overhead to run what in production just needs to be a Kubernetes cluster feels like a lot to me.
It's a very valid point.
Well, we better get out of here then. But before we go, just a quick thank you to all of our existing PayPal supporters and patrons. You can join those people at hybridcloudshow.com/support. And please do send in any questions or feedback to show@hybridcloudshow.com or spread the word to a friend of yours. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.